Good morning, gardening friends. Today we're going to build a box like the two that you see in the center of the picture there. I've been building these boxes for a few years. Turns out they will store about 1/3 of a cubic foot of soil, which is a fair amount of soil. And you can see that my Swiss chard is doing actually quite nicely in these boxes. I've also got a longer form version of the box. If you want to see this one, go ahead and drop me a note, and if I get enough of them, I'll make another box. So the first thing we're going to need is materials, and for that I've got a single dog-eared cedar fence board. This is about 5.5 inches wide and about 1/2 inch thick. The key is I'm going to use this one board. I'm going to cut it into 7 pieces, and those 7 pieces are going to form a box like that. The key to doing this with one board is a little bit of math. So what we really need to know is we need to know the critical dimensions. We need to know how wide is the board, and you actually kind of want to measure top to bottom and see if there's some variation. You also need to know the thickness of the board and ultimately the length of the board from top to bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and get those dimensions, and we're going to write them right here on the board. Okay, so it turns out the board is 5 5/16 wide, it is 9/16 thick, and it is 6 feet and 1/8 of an inch. Now, as far as the length, one of the key things here is I'm just going to go with 6 feet to do my calculations, and I'm not going to worry about the 1/8 of an inch, because ultimately if you look at these boxes, let me see if I can't get in here a little bit, you can see that the back of the box is not perfectly lined up with everything else, but you don't really see the back of the box all that much, and if I ignore that 1/8 of an inch, it might make it just a little bit taller. Now that's one particular effort I did on that one. This one actually, the box ended up being a little bit taller than that. Let me see, I'm trying to get the leaves out of the way so you can see. So it's a little bit taller. Basically we're just going to let it kind of take up the difference in the back. Along the front, I didn't line these up perfectly either, but ultimately once you got a plant spilling out over it, you're not really going to see that. So this is a 6-foot board. That's what we're starting with, and we're also starting with about 5 1/4. 5 5/16 is pretty close to 5 1/4. That dimension is not super critical, so I can change the 5 5/16 to 5 1/4. The one that's going to potentially hurt us is the 9/16. Now, I mean, this should in theory be 1/2 inch thick. If I wanted to, I could run it through a planer and we could get it down to exact, but we're just doing rough math here. Now, the 7 pieces of this are the bottom, which you can't see at all, but there is a bottom piece, and you can see that I've actually screwed into that. There's a bottom piece, there's 2 side pieces for each side, and there's front and a back. So that's a total of 7 pieces. That means we're going to need to make 6 cuts. Now, one thing to consider is on those 6 cuts is what they call the kerf, which is the amount of wood that you're going to lose to actually cutting, what gets converted into sawdust, and that's usually a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. Actually, an 1/8 of an inch would be pretty bad. 1/16 of an inch, I'm guessing that my saw here, my little hand saw, and you could use power tools if you wanted to. I have a table saw, but it's not worth pulling out for this project. If you look at it, the thickness of the blade itself, it's probably about a 1/16 of an inch. If you figure you're going to make 6 cuts, then you're going to have 6 times the 1/16 of an inch, or 3/8 of an inch. So that's going to, right off the bat, that's going to get removed from the board. That's going to leave us with, if 6 feet is 72 inches, it's going to leave us with 71 5/8 inches. We can then do a little bit further math. We need to figure that the bottom piece is actually going to be the smallest piece of all. And everything gets based on that bottom piece because you've got a front and a back mounted at the ends of it, not on top of it. And so the front and the back account for another, in this case, 9/16 of an inch on each count. So you've now got 9/8 of an inch, or 1 1/8 inches. That needs to be added to the dimension of the bottom in order to get the length of the side pieces. Once you've got the side pieces and the bottom figured out, what remains is the front and the back. Now you can divide the front and the back in half, or what you really want to do is you want to consider the width of the board is 5 5/16 here. So ultimately you want the front to be double that because you've got two pieces that are that width on each side. So 5 5/16 twice is going to give us 10 5/8. Am I doing that right? Yeah, 10 5/8. Now I already did some of the math, and I'll go ahead and lay this out in the video. When I kind of pre-measured all of this and pre-figured it all, I figured it on 5.5. I think we're going to come up okay. I'm not too worried. The box doesn't have to look perfect. But once I did all of the algebra involved, I ended up with about 8 3/4 inches as my base. That means the bottom piece is going to be 8 3/4 inches. The side pieces are going to be the 8 3/4 plus the extra 1.125. So that's going to be 9 7/8. So almost 10 inches, but not quite. So 9 7/8 inches for the side pieces, and then the front and the back are going to be 10 5/8. At least I'll do the front as 10 5/8, and what remains will be the back. So those are my dimensions. I'm going to mark the first dimension. I'm going to cut the base first at 8 3/4. I'm going to start right at the bottom there. I'm going to make a mark, and I'm going to cut. Okay, the bottom is now cut. Now onto the side pieces. Okay, so now we have the bottom. We have the 4 side pieces, and what remains is the front and back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the front, which, if you remember, our width was 5 5/8, 5 5/16, sorry. So that means we're going to have 10 5/8 for the front, and then whatever remains will go in the back. Okay, so that's all the pieces cut, and you can see they're a little bit rough, so I'm going to do a little bit of sanding, and then the next step will be actually putting them together. Okay, for assembly, I've decided I'm going to use some 1.5 inch galvanized nails, and I'm going to pre-drill the holes. I've just kind of learned over time that pre-drilling the holes works a little bit better in terms of The problem is you end up taking, this is the bottom piece here, and I'm going to end up having to attach the front piece to the bottom, so maybe I can put the front piece like this. See, I keep flipping, I'm trying to do it one-handed, that doesn't help either, but I end up putting the two pieces kind of like this. Well, you kind of get the idea, and then I can drill a hole through the front piece to the bottom piece. Once I get two pieces together, then it'll kind of stand up on its own and I can do the rest of it, but it's easier if I pre-drill before I actually put the nails in. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, now maybe you can see what I mean, that once you get that first piece on, then the next piece, we're going to go on mostly like that. So that's what I'm going to do. Drill a couple of holes, put in a couple of nails. We'll be halfway there. Alright, now we're starting to take shape. One thing you might find is that your front and back aren't exactly parallel, like these two aren't, but ultimately once I put the sides on, I can kind of straighten that out. Kind of looks like I know what I'm doing, doesn't it? Not too bad. You can see now, I mean, there's quite a bit of space in there, but the one thing remaining is you got to make a decision. Do you want to have your box draining or not? In this case, I mean, there's a little bit of leakage because the cuts are not perfect. You can kind of see down there that that's not perfectly straight cut, and probably about the same in the corners there. So it will leak a little bit of water. It's not a watertight box by any means, but I'm going to go ahead and get a drill bit and drill some holes in the bottom. Okay, a couple of final tips here. One, I put it up against the wall and put the back, which was sticking up from the whole thing, outbound to the wall there, so that ultimately the whole thing will sit flat and you can drill your holes. Another thing is, when you're putting something like this together, is to watch out for the knots. I try to, when I pick a piece of wood, this is cedar, it's considered a fence board, basically to make big fences out of it. They're just about 5.5 inches wide, and you just line them all up in a row, and that's why it's got that dog ear at the top there to create a decorative fence. I just take advantage of it for the back, and in fact, actually, I'll get back to the knot in a second. If you take a bunch of these and line them up, if you happen to have like a patio with a wall, you can line them up, one here, another one next to it, another one next to that, and it kind of looks like a fence sitting on your wall. And so people don't necessarily see the plants until they start to grow, and it just looks like a fence, so it looks nice. Something I did back a few years ago. I'll see if I can find a picture and show you. But back to the knots, all I was going to say is with these knots, you want to try and get as few knots as possible when you select your board, but if you end up having to have knots, then when you put your nails in, you don't want to get too close to the knot, otherwise you could have problems, you could have it split out on you. Also, you want to kind of select your board in such a way that it's kind of hard to predict unless you bring a tape measure and you got your whole cut plan laid out and everything to try and figure out exactly where all the knots are going to land when you do your cuts. If you need to, you could ultimately plan around that, and instead of cutting in the order that I did, cut in a slightly different order, but ultimately I think you want your back piece to be the last piece. You want to have the back piece attached to another piece, and then when you make your final cut. So that will play into it. If you want to figure out the height of the back, then you can use that to figure out whether or not there's knots, whether there's going to be a knot right here when you cut. It's a lot of potential figuring, but for $2.50 for board, it's, and maybe 20 cents worth of nails, I don't know. It's not a bad project to experiment with. So, and I do call myself the budget gardener. I do try to do things on a budget. Admittedly, all of the hardscaping I've done this year has put me back a few dollars, not too much. I mean, I'm buying cheaper materials. I'm not buying super high-end. I'm not putting this all together with mortar and everything, so it's temporary. I can move things around and reconfigure. A lot of the boxes I have, I already had from last year, so that's another thing. These boxes will last a few years. I've got some that are probably 10 years old now. I need to check on because I actually gave them away, but we'll find out. But I just like this project. It's a simple box to make. I've now cut, you can see it's a little rough down there, but I mean, I've cut my holes so it'll drain. All I gotta do is fill it with soil. And there was a plant that I bought, and I said, gee, what pot am I gonna put it in? Oh wait, let's do another box, and I can make a video about it. So that's how this kind of came about. This is the second video on my channel making a box like this. So hopefully this one's a little bit better. And with that, I hope you have fun making your own. This is the Budget Gardener signing off, saying may your thumb be green.